And welcome back to day 2. Regina here, and I just want to go ahead and introduce session 5, I think we're up to. So this particular session will focus on Indigenous peoples, and we're going to start off with Tom and then go to Sylvia, and then I will be presenting. So without further ado, Tom, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, my name is Tom Younger, and today I'm presenting a paper called Our Struggle Continues, Confronting the Dynamics of Dispossession in the Peruvian Amazon, the case of Santa Clara the Uchunya and their fight to obtain justice and regain their territory. The Shipibo-Canibo community of Santa Clara and the Peruvian Amazon is struggling against the dispossession and devastation of their ancestral lands due to the aggressive expansion of oil palm. This article considers the social and cultural impacts of agribusiness-led deforestation on the community and their territory, looks at some of the political and legal strategies they've developed together with allies to demand restitution and remediation of their ancestral lands, and considers some of the key successes and challenges faced during the past 5 years of this struggle. I offer this particular perspective as an action researcher and anthropologist who's been working in solidarity with the community since early 2016. For the past 3 years, I've been working with Forest Peoples Programme, which is an international organization that supports Indigenous and forest peoples in the defense of their rights and territories in more than 20 countries throughout Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Forest Peoples Programme supports Indigenous peoples and local communities' struggles to create political spaces through which to defend their collective rights, govern their territories, and determine their futures. As Indigenous communities, we are the owners of these forests because we are natives and grew from these lands. Our city, our village, is the forest, where we used to walk freely with our elders, our grandparents. They would go into the forest to bring collared peccaries, deer, and giant turtles. Our custom is that we do not have boundaries to our lands. That is how we walk through the forest. And those are the words of Wilson Barbaran Soria, who's a leader from Santa Clara. When community members from Santa Clara the Uchunya, a Shipibo-Canibo indigenous community located on the banks of the Aguaitia River in the low jungle of the Peruvian Amazon, talk about their ancestral territory, there is a before and an after. Luisa, a woman leader from the community, puts it this way. Before, we walked freely. Now, we are like hunted animals. We have to take care whenever we walk anywhere, from fear. This rupture in time and in people's relationship with their territory occurred with the entry of a transnational oil palm company, Plantaciones de Pucallpa, today Ocho Sur P. Starting in 2012, the company destroyed more than 7,000 hectares of forest and stripped the community of a vital part of their traditional lands. Practically overnight, in historical terms, the company's aggressive expansion of oil palm monoculture has forced radical changes in the way of life of the community. Wilson, who's now in his 40s, describes some of these changes. Before, we used to set out from here to go hunting and sleep in the forest. We would stay out for anywhere between 8 and 15 days. We would make our way there, set up our campfires, and eat out there. 3 or 4 families would go together to hunt there. We would build a campfire and all eat together. That was our custom. It's not that today we no longer want to. Now one cannot even walk there safely on the other side of the river where the plantation is now located. Nowadays, if they see us, the people there act like thugs, treating us as though we were thieves. We used to walk freely. They're putting an end to our customs. Who's responsible? The state. The Shipibo people have inhabited the lands to the west of the Aguaitia and Ucayali rivers for generations. As you can see on the map on the left, which was drawn up by Franciscan missionaries 2 centuries ago, which today hangs in the Franciscan convent of Santa Rosa de Ocopo, outside of Huancayo, which shows the Sipibos, as occupying the lands which Santa Clara de Uchunya are struggling to reclaim today, several centuries later. Despite this long-standing historical recognition of the Shipibo's traditional territoriality, the continuing structural oppression of indigenous peoples in Peru means that the community lack full formal recognition of their ownership rights over the entirety of their ancestral lands. Thus, when Plantaciones de Pucallpa's workers started destroying Santa Clara's traditional forests in 2012, the community were only in possession of a collective land title granted in 1986, covering 218 hectares, which is a minuscule portion of the territory which the community has traditionally possessed and occupied for generations, which covers more than 86,000 hectares. If the community's lifeways were previously oriented towards abundant and carefully tended forests, today in a new context of scarcity created by the intense enclosure and dispossession of their lands, families from Santa Clara de Uchunya must depend more and more on the market economy to meet their needs. As community members point out time and again with reference to the game animals, fish, and other forest food, plant medicines, construction materials, and clean water that they previously provisioned themselves with from within their territory, there is nothing left. A community member who just several years ago was able to construct the roof of his home using charbon leaf, harvested from nearby, must now instead buy corrugated iron sheet, since that part of the territory was invaded and made unsafe by land traffickers. The same goes for traditional medicine. Wilson says, our medicine was chuchuhuasi, flavohuasca, sangre de grado, copaiba resin. Our elders used to diet these plants for 3 days to a week to cleanse and heal their bodies. Before we didn't need injections or pills, those who felt unwell would go into the forest. Our elders, who were around 80 years old, walked strong because they treated themselves with those medicines. Plant medicines were the best medicine we had, but today there is no more. The devastation of the living ecosystems that make up the community's territory and the loss of practices intimately linked to this place not only hinder the community's lifeways and well-being in the present, but also give rise to strong anxieties about the future. Fidel, a young man, asks, our concern as young people is that if we do not know many animals at this age, what will it be like later for our children? And Louisa adds, before we had everything we needed. For us, our market was our territory. Now we can no longer walk for even an hour because we're under threat. That's why I'm concerned, because tomorrow, in the future, what will our children eat? How are they going to feed their children? I recall how my mother and father fed us, and we can no longer do that. And it's going to be much worse for them, because now there's nothing. They're not even going to know what it is to turn a tree into a canoe, as is our custom. They're not going to know our medicines, because there are none left. Everything is being destroyed. Before, we ate well, we grew to be strong and fat. But now, what happens to our children? They suffer from diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. The company's arrival and continuing presence has driven fierce competition for control over lands between groups of non-Indigenous or mestizo settlers from other regions of Peru dedicated to what is known locally as land trafficking. Damert characterizes this phenomenon as the perverse and systematic use of state titling mechanisms to incorporate lands into market circuits and profit from them. Both individuals and organized groups occupy and take possession of lands which lack formal legal recognition and seek to obtain possession certificates from the regional agrarian agencies, typically clearing any forest on such lands in the process. Indeed, forest clearance is incentivized by Peru's essentially agrarian land use classification system, which dates back to the 1970s, which also stipulates that people claiming rights to land must demonstrate economic activity, i.e., by clearing forest, to install agro-pastoral systems. These possession certificates, which may subsequently be converted into individual land titles, may be later sold on to commercial buyers, as was the case with Plantaciones de Pucallpa. This forms part of a larger ongoing process across the Peruvian Amazon of the commodification of collectively held indigenous lands and their forced incorporation into a commercial land market, ever expanding commodity production, and international circuits of capital accumulation. The impacts highlighted above have led to the reconfiguration and emergence of social hierarchies based on gender, race, and class. These include the destruction of Santa Clara de Uchunya's communal and household autonomy and non-monetary territorial provisioning systems, forcing both men and women to seek waged work where possible, often outside of the community, increasing the burden of care work for women and elderly people who then remain in the community. Men and women from the community have also been divested of the power to decide over what happens within their land, with decisions of vital importance for their lives and futures being taken by non-Indigenous mestizo men representing the Peruvian state and offices in the cities of Pucallpa and Lima, as well as the Euro-American men who make up Ocho Sur's directors and shareholders. A stark example of the racialized discourses which commonly circulate are comments by the ex-director of the Ucayali Agrarian Agency, Isaac Guaman Perez, who repeatedly expressed his rejection of indigenous people's customary land rights, arguing in the case of Santa Clara de Uchunya that ancestral property is a thing of the past, and unequivocally stating that indigenous peoples want to enforce the law of the jungle. On the other hand, Guaman made numerous public announcements on the urgent need to recognize the customary possession rights of settlers, and even attempted to change prevailing forest laws to dissolve permanent production forests to achieve this goal, making clear the priority that he attributes to the rights of non-Indigenous peoples and their land uses. As will be expanded upon below, the Shipibo people's territoriality, comprising the multiple ways in which they relate to their territory, has been largely ignored by the state in its interventions, which has tended to focus, at best, on important, though narrowly conceived, environmental aspects of the case, such as quantifying the deforestation which has occurred. And the racialized hierarchies according to which the plantation itself operates are also worthy of remark. Whilst white Euro-American men hold power in running Ocho Sur's plantation, Shipibo leaders have observed that many of the 1,700 workers whose labor is exploited there are themselves indigenous people from Ucayali and neighboring regions, such as Loreto. The resulting conflicts have exposed the Shipibo community to intimidation, threats, and attack. Community members, leaders, and allies who've made a stand to protect their territory against the spread of land grabbing and forest destruction have been subjected to verbal abuse, threatened and warned to abandon their homes, received death threats, and been shot at on multiple occasions. These abuses and threats have prevented community members from moving through their territory. People who have asserted their right to freely access their traditional lands have been met by groups of men wielding machetes, sticks, and firearms. Shipibo land defenders have also been targeted and defamed by regional authorities and in the regional press and media. For the past 6 years, the community has been fighting to defend what remains of their forests, waters, and way of life, prevent further deforestation and oil palm expansion, and ultimately to ensure legal and practical control over their ancestral territory. The community has taken direct action to intervene and halt further deforestation, protested and denounced these violations and the devastation caused to their home, both locally and internationally. The community has taken a series of legal actions in defense of their territory, using both criminal and constitutional judicial mechanisms. In May 2015, the community filed a criminal complaint against the palm oil company, at that time Plantaciones de Pucallpa, for deforestation. The case was initially investigated by a local prosecutor in Ucayali before being transferred to a prosecutor specializing in organized crime in Lima, after it was determined that the case involved organized crime. In January 2018, a court issued a precautionary measure ordering the company to immediately suspend its activities. However, this injunction was never enforced, and 5 years after the original complaint was filed, the company continues its operations with apparent impunity. In May 2016, the community, together with their representative Indigenous organization, the Federation of Native Communities of Ucayali, presented a constitutional lawsuit against the company and the regional government of Ucayali and public registry officials who facilitated the land grab. This lawsuit seeks the restitution, collective titling and remediation of the community's ancestral land. The claim was rejected by 2 courts in Ucayali before being admitted for consideration by Peru's highest court, the Constitutional Tribunal, which in August 2018 announced that it would resolve the case. The hearing took place just over a year ago, in September 2019. The community's claim was strengthened by an expert legal briefing provided by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Victoria Tali-Corpus, underscoring Peru's legal obligations to formally recognize the community's traditional lands. The community are currently awaiting the court's ruling on this case. The community have also shared their testimonies and demanded solutions in international spaces, such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and during a formal mission by the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders to Peru in January of this year. Whilst the aforementioned actions have been primarily directed towards the Peruvian state, the community and allies have also sought to hold accountable the companies involved by making use of non-judicial redress mechanisms, such as the complaints mechanism of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO, a global body that seeks to improve the sustainability of palm oil supply chains. Both Plantaciones de Pucallpa and another plantation which expanded at the same time immediately to the south, Plantaciones Ucayali, form part of a complex web of agribusiness companies which have used secrecy rules in overseas jurisdictions to avoid accountability for their activities. This corporate web has come to be known in Peru as the Malka Group of agribusiness companies, named after a Czech US businessman, Denis Malka. Malka, who was previously implicated in agribusiness-led deforestation and human rights violations as co-founder and joint CEO of Asian Plantations Limited in Malaysia, has gained notoriety in Peru and globally during recent years, the industrial-scale deforestation and rights violations associated with his oil palm and cacao plantations in Ucayali and Loreto. The community and allies have targeted formal complaints of the RSPO, both against Plantaciones de Pucallpa, but also companies that have been buying and processing oil palm from their devastated lands, including the Miller Alpesa and Peru's largest consumer goods company, Alicorp. So, successes, challenges, and limitations. While the community is still fighting for a definitive solution to ensure the restitution and remediation of their territory, their unified stance and solidarity from allies has resulted in some significant successes. At great personal risk, the community members have organized territorial patrols to monitor their lands. They've undertaken the self-demarcation of their territory and intervened on multiple occasions to prevent further logging of their forests by settlers, exercising their right to administer indigenous justice in defense of their territory to confiscate logging equipment. In September 2015, the Peruvian Ministry of Agriculture ordered the oil palm company to suspend its operations. In April 2016, the RSPO issued the company with a stop work order. The community's continued resistance and mounting legal actions are likely what precipitated the auction of Plantaciones de Pucallpa and Ucayali's plantations to another set of companies, Ocho Sur P and Ocho Sur U, in July 2016. And Plantaciones de Pucallpa subsequently withdrew from the RSPO in October 2016. In February 2017, United Cacao, another company linked to Malca and one of Plantaciones de Pucallpa's financiers, was excluded from the London Stock Exchange's alternative investment market. When the Constitutional Court agreed to resolve the community's claim for protection in August 2018, this in fact marked the first time that this court would decide on the titling of Indigenous territories, which set an important precedent for Indigenous peoples across the country, many of whom lack any form of official recognition of their traditional lands. The community's defense of their territory also gained a further boost in February of this year, when the regional government of Ucayali repealed a regional ordinance which sought to remove protections for more than 3.5 million hectares of rainforest and facilitate the invasion of Indigenous lands, including a significant part of Santa Clara's territory. Despite these significant milestones, the structures of impunity in Peru mean that the condemned plantation has, however, been able to keep operating on the community's lands. The legal actions started by the community, including both the criminal investigations and the constitutional lawsuit, have been subject to intense delays and setbacks. Administrative processes have faced similar obstacles. Despite the community and allies' best efforts, even a partial land title extension covering the community's lands between the River Aguaitia and the oil palm plantation is still yet to be fully formalized. Santa Clara leaders and community members who've taken a stand in defense of their lands have been subjected to criminalization, threats, and violence. Despite having reported these threats to various state entities, including Congress members, the Human Rights Ombudsman, and various ministries, members of the community and FECONAU, their Indigenous organization, have not received effective protection measures. All but 2 of the dozen personal security guarantees requested by community members since 2016 after receiving death threats have in fact been rejected by the Ministry of the Interior, allowing the perpetrators to continue to act with impunity. Furthermore, complaints filed following shootings in December 2017 and July 2018 against community members were thrown out by the Interior Ministries due to the Interior Ministry's incapacity to identify those responsible. Community members who've exercised Indigenous justice by confiscating chainsaws and expelling land traffickers from their lands have also been subject to further intimidation and repression in the form of malicious judicial actions by the traffickers, who accuse them of crimes such as robbery, damages, and duress. Having to respond to these spurious allegations compounds the psychosocial impacts experienced by community members and demands more of their limited energy and resources. A significant barrier which impedes the community's access to justice is the fact that, amazingly, they're not considered to be an affected party with regard to the deforestation which has taken place in their territory. Peruvian law stipulates that forests constitute the patrimony of the nation. Therefore, it is the state and not the community that is harmed by these crimes. This shows complete disregard for the fact that it is frontline community members who are actively organizing to patrol and protect their territories and forests, something which the state does not do. Rather than supporting these community-led forms of territorial defense, the state limits itself to offering community leaders who face death threats for undertaking this very dangerous work ineffective and reactive protection protocols for human rights defenders. This also prevents the community from participating in and giving momentum to criminal investigations, which instead must depend on prosecutors who all too often lack the resources and personnel to investigate and resolve cases. Furthermore, this lack of regard for Indigenous peoples' experiences mean that such investigations and the judgments which result usually fail to take into account the social and cultural impact of environmental crimes. Mounting resistance from the community and allies from 2014 onwards, and the high-profile denunciations against Plantaciones de Pucallpa, The high-profile denunciations against the oil palm company have been met with numerous attempts by the company to avoid accountability and neutralize these demands for justice. Amidst increasing economic disruption, the oil palm company made use of trusts and a subsequent auction organized in an irregular way in June 2016, through which both plantations were sold for $62 million to two recently formed companies, Uchunya and Uchunya. The shares for both companies would appear to be held by a third company known as Peruvian Palm Holdings Limited, which was set up in Bermuda a few weeks after the RSPO issued its stop work order, and the day after news emerged that Peruvian authorities had verified and documented that the oil palm company continued operating in violation of the stop orders. Malka, who previously directed Plantaciones de Pucallpa, was one of Peruvian Palm Holdings' directors until the middle of this year. Other directors of Peruvian Palm Holdings include principals and partners from several US-based private equity firms specializing in agribusiness investment, including Anhalt Services USA Inc. and Amara Capital Management LSC. The former also previously invested in United Oils, which was the original parent company of both of Malka's plantations in Ucayali, which was domiciled, like Malka's other company, United Cacao, in the Cayman Islands. This use of complex corporate structures and secrecy jurisdictions such as the Cayman Islands and Bermuda has made it very difficult to trace the owners and financiers of Uchunya, and holding them accountable for these destructive investments proves an enduring challenge. This specific case of land tenure and human rights violations by Uchunya again raises legitimate questions over the accountability of international investors and financiers to Indigenous peoples who are directly and indirectly harmed by their transnational financing and crediting activities. The Peruvian state's unwillingness to resolve the case has continuing impacts on the community, their territory, and way of life. A recent satellite analysis, which is playing in the background, determined that between 2001 and August 2020, over 16,000 hectares of the community's forest, an area significantly larger than the island of Jersey, were cleared. Whilst the highest rates of deforestation occurred in 2013, during the initial clearance of the plantation, the second highest rates were last year in 2019. This most recent forest destruction has been occurring in the community's territory to the west of the plantation. Rates of forest loss in mid-2020 amid the pandemic lockdown were already 35% higher than for the same period in 2019. And as the main clearing season in the Amazon begins for 2020, it seems likely that this will be in the top 3 worst years on record, if not the worst. Okay. So, wrapping up, alternatives: remain in the territory, regain the future. I've described the impacts of massive deforestation and oil palm expansion on Santa Clara's lifeways, practices, and autonomy in terms of their access to their territory, food, water, plant medicine, and other materials. And I've also shown how the oil palms plantations establishment was both facilitated by and has in turn accelerated local processes of land trafficking based on the dispossession and commodification of collectively held Indigenous lands, and how these processes in turn have led to the reconfiguration of social hierarchies based on gender, race, and class, usually linked to control over territory. I've also outlined the different strategies for resisting undertaken by the community and their allies, ranging from direct action to legal actions, advocacy, and the use of non-judicial redress mechanisms. And though these actions have been successful in disrupting the company and halting its further expansion, thus far they have not met their goals of land restitution and remediation. I've also pointed out how the Peruvian state has failed both to support the community's efforts to defend their territory and to protect community members and allies who face threats, attacks, and criminalization. The fact that frontline Indigenous communities such as Santa Clara are prevented from fully participating in investigations over deforestation is a formidable obstacle to social and ecological justice and protection. At the same time, the company's destructive operations have been facilitated by the use of elaborate corporate structures and secrecy jurisdictions, posing significant practical challenges for holding these actors to account and demanding corporate accountability. To close, during 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic expanded across the Peruvian Amazon, infecting more than 10,000 Indigenous people and claiming the lives of many cherished Indigenous elders, knowledge bearers, and leaders. During the national state of emergency, Ocho Sur did not cease its agro-industrial activities, and when Peruvian authorities visited the plantation in early June, they found that 90% of the plantation's workers tested positive for COVID. A community member from Santa Clara reports that in the community there have been 2 deaths already, an elderly lady and a baby with symptoms of coronavirus. And he says that the company has got rid of our medicinal plants, our clinic. Where will we get medication during the pandemic? They've closed off the forest to us, and they treat us like thieves within our own territory. This is sad, and we want action to be taken now. The court must return our land that we and our elders have taken care of for many years. The Amazonian Indigenous peoples find themselves on the front lines both of the pandemic health crisis, as well as the ongoing dangerous struggle to protect their territories and forests of life in the midst of an unprecedented planetary climate and biodiversity emergency, makes visible the deep fractures of inequality and power which underlie the interconnected eco-social crises of our moment. Confronting both the COVID-19 pandemic and the pandemic of violence and dispossession means putting Indigenous peoples' rights and self-determination at the centre of our responses to the immense challenges faced by forest peoples and the whole of humanity. And crucially, this means recognising Indigenous territories. As one collective of Amazonian Indigenous organisations put it in a statement issued in Ucayali in July, we live in a system that has always relegated us and made us invisible, but today we say enough is enough, no more. It is time for change, justice and equality. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening.
Very much, Tom. Presentation this morning, and we're going to turn to Sylvia next. So as soon as Sylvia is ready and ready to share her screen with us, then we will move on.
Sorry, it took me a few seconds to get started, but Thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you very much, Regina, for organizing this very important and timely discussion about environmental crimes, and I'm very pleased to be able to be part of it. My presentation is titled Environmental Factors as a Driving Force of Violence Against Indigenous Women. This presentation is based on a case study which I completed in West Papua, and which was published in the report of Gender, Climate and Security, Sustaining Inclusive Peace on the Front Lines of Climate Change. This report has been coordinated by the UN Environment Programme, and it was a joint effort by various UN agencies, and with the main aim is to building bridges between the UN's WPS agenda, Women, Peace and Security agenda, and climate change impact, which is increasingly aggravating security. These two links are included in the slide. This report is, of course, available online, and the entire report, it includes 11 case studies from different regions from the world, and there is also a direct link to the case study on West Papua. So let's start talking about West Papua then, every discussion about West Papua really needs to start with its colonial history. Because whatever the situation may be in West Papua, it cannot be separated. It cannot be considered in isolation from its colonial legacy. Following for more than 1 century Dutch colonial rule in the territory, the status of West Papua was repeatedly discussed in the UN General Assembly during the 1950s and 60s, and it was pretty much a heated debate between the Netherlands and Indonesia. Because the Netherlands was insisting on West Papua being decolonized in accordance with the UN Charter, while Indonesia was insisting on that the territory was forming an integral part of Indonesia, and it should be returned to that state without any consultation of its population. This was all happening during the Cold War, and the Dutch position was supported by Western states, whereas the Indonesian position was supported by communist countries. So there was a deadlock, obviously, in the discussion, and an attempt to break this deadlock was the adoption of the 1962 New York Agreement, which is a bilateral treaty between the Netherlands and Indonesia. So that is already raising, from a legal point of view, some questions about is that a valid legal basis for an act of self-determination as an exercise of the right of self-determination of peoples under international law. After the adoption of the New York Agreement, control over West Papua was transferred to a temporary UN administration, the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority. This UN administration lasted for less than a year, and in 1963, control over the territory was, so to say, given to Indonesia by the United Nations. But this transfer of control was made conditional on an exercise of the right of self-determination, act of self-determination. This requirement was also included in the New York Agreement, and it can be found in Article 18, Section D, which clearly says that an act of self-determination needs to take place in accordance with international standards. And international standards of decolonization included a referendum based on the principle of one man, one vote. What happened, however, is this act of self-determination, so-called act of self-determination, was organized in the form of the 1969 Act of Free Choice. The Papuan people generally refer to it as an act of no choice. Because contrary to what was required by the New York Agreement and international law on this matter, this act of free choice was conducted while the territory was under heavy Indonesian military control. And a little more than 1,000 Papuan representatives were selected by the Indonesian military to represent a population at that time an estimated 800,000. And those selected electors voted unanimously for integration within Indonesia, while literally being held under gunpoint. So it has been, it has the legacy, the validity of this act of self-determination has been contested, of course, by many, and it has been described as a substantial denial of the right of self-determination. So in successive years, so we are now 60 years further already, but West Papua has remained a military territory, with the situation continuously deteriorating, and there is a real risk to escalate into an internal armed conflict. Military operations in West Papua are taking place regularly, and this is a widespread pattern of violent attacks by military forces against indigenous Papuans. There is institutionalized discrimination and marginalization of the indigenous people, and those military actions are regularly involved not just murder but extrajudicial killings, torture and ill treatment, sexual and gender-based violence. The Indonesian authorities have also engaged in a widespread transmigration, a large-scale transmigration policy, which is also coupled with a very pervasive pattern of internal displacement as a result of the military actions by the Indonesian forces. So the reason why Indonesia has been so determined to secure integration of West Papua into its territory is, of course, the vast array of natural resources this territory has. So while this military situation, this conflict in West Papua for now taking place for 6 decades, of course, political and social economic factors have been the major driver of conflict, but it has been also greatly shaped and influenced by the natural resources of the territory. In this sense, the case study is mainly focusing on two major extraction projects: the Grasberg mine in West Papua, which holds one of the world's largest gold and copper, and palm oil projects close to the international border with Papua New Guinea. There are, of course, many other extraction projects ongoing in West Papua, but the case studies are focusing on these two major projects. What we see there is that resource extraction in West Papua really cannot be considered in isolation from the territory's unresolved political conflict, because this is taking place, resource extraction is taking place against the backdrop of political instability and violence, military violence, which is often linked to access to and control over natural resources. So on the one hand, we see a very close relationship, very close link between Indonesian security forces and the extraction industry. On the other hand, we also see that resource extraction in West Papua has resulted in massive environmental degradation and pollution. This is also coupled with a huge influx of Indonesian migrants who have been attracted to the territory by the economic opportunities these resources represent, of course. Such migration, whether government sponsored under the transmigration policy or spontaneous, has created additional social and ethnic tensions between tribes and between Indonesian migrants and Papuan people due to the increased competition over land and resources. So the Grasberg mine, which, as I mentioned already, I think holds one of the world's largest gold deposit. It has proved to be a significant moneymaker, significant tax generator for the Indonesian government, but also a highly lucrative business for Indonesian military forces. Extraction site is routinely guarded by Indonesian police and military forces, which has, of course, led to additional clashes, violent clashes between these forces and the indigenous people living in the vicinity of the extraction site. And the same we also see happening around the palm oil project in the eastern provinces of West Papua. This also resulted in a large-scale relocation of indigenous communities, various tribes, due to the expansion of the extraction site. So the other important pattern we see as a connection between these political violence, socioeconomic forces, and resource extraction is that such an unfettered and continuously expanding extraction in West Papua has resulted in devastating environmental damage. So unsound extraction practices have led to rampant deforestation with devastating consequences for the traditional livelihoods, the land and the resources of these forest-dependent communities. So, in conclusion, resource extraction in West Papua is characterized by heavy involvement of military forces, full neglect of indigenous rights to land and resources, and also inadequate and highly unequal sharing of benefits and extreme environmental degradation. As such, resource extraction industry in West Papua is intersecting with the existing structural political vulnerabilities and represents a significant contributing factor to violence and displacement among indigenous people. Another aspect of the case study is looking into the link between conflict and climate change. So, with all those hardship already the indigenous communities in West Papua enduring, the climate change impact, increasing climate change impact in the territory is intensifying, and the risk of conflict and insecurity by that has further increased. West Papua has already witnessed rapidly changing weather patterns in recent years, including extreme weather events such as floods, drought, and landslides, which have contributed significantly to food and water insecurity of indigenous communities. The effect of climate change on conflict and insecurity is regarded as indirect, but nevertheless, it should not be underestimated because it will influence the underlying root causes of tension and conflict in West Papua. So, this climate change impact in West Papua has disrupted traditional food and water resources in several regions within the country. If we combine this with the heavy extractive pressure, which also includes deforestation, pollution, and population growth due migration, food and water insecurity will further increase. And this will affect marginalized indigenous communities the most. Extreme weather events like flash floods, for example, have further destroyed livelihoods and left entire communities displaced. This feeds into the wider sense of insecurity and fear among the indigenous communities. It also triggers local conflict between various tribes as the resources, food and water resources, are diminishing. To the gender dimensions, that also the third element of the case study. What are the gender patterns in conflict in West Papua? How is that aggravated by environmental factors such as resource extraction and climate change? So gender is woven into the dense patterns of marginalization, poverty, and violence in West Papua. Indonesian security forces have been repeatedly implicated in rape, and also other forms of sexual violence, mostly targeting women and girls, but there are also records of gender-based violence committed against male members of indigenous communities. Some records are actually describing particularly sadistic sexual attacks on indigenous people. This is closely linked to the territory's unresolved political conflict because historically, the Indonesian forces were focusing on eliminating Papuan pro-independence movements in the territory, and therefore female relatives of suspected independence movement members have become target of military violence, intimidation, including sexual violence and torture. So there is also a pattern of rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence in the vicinity of the Grasberg mine, as well as this massive palm oil project I have been talking about, which have led to some concerns that sexual violence by Indonesian forces is being used as a method of land grabbing in order to secure further expansion of the extraction sites. The injuries suffered by the victims are further aggravated by severe social stigmatization and lead to an aggravated sense of isolation among women and girls. This has also an intergenerational impact because it's also attached to the children of these women who have been victimized by sexual violence. Right. So, in addition to extremely high levels of sexual violence by military forces, there is an equally high level of domestic violence in West Papua as well. And this is actually the phenomenon which is referred to as a layered violence. Victims who have been attacked, who have been subject to sexual violence by military forces, bear a much greater risk of also becoming a victim of domestic violence within their own families and communities. So beyond violent attacks, either by state forces or on a domestic level, the loss of traditional lands and resources due to resource extraction and climate change impact has a disproportionate burden on indigenous women. This is also linked to military operations because many rural communities have fled from their villages into the forest or were forcibly evicted by military to secure the expansion of extraction sites, and continued military operations prevent communities from returning to their villages. So land and resources which they were holding traditionally are lost. So the position of women is further very weak in this context because traditional lands are mainly belong to the male members of the community, and when the male family members sell the land to extractive companies, whole communities become displaced as well. Such displacement has resulted in loss of traditional cultural and agricultural activities, which means that Papuan women and girls who have the traditional role of taking care of their families and communities cannot exercise their traditional gender-based roles anymore, which in turn again leads to additional risk of domestic violence. The increasing impact of climate change has further aggravated these challenges. So gender permeates decades of violence in West Papua, and it is very closely linked to the specific context of the region's unresolved political conflict, because it is through gendered acts that Indonesian forces have secured unfettered access to and maximalized extraction of resources. Papuan women and girls have been targeted by forces because of their gender-based roles, because their mothers, as sisters, as daughters, whose primary role is to take care of their families and take care of their traditional lands and resources. So some conclusions before I'm running out of time. I started the presentation by saying that every discussion needs to start with the colonial history, with the colonial origins of West Papua. And I'm also ending with that because in order to move forward, we really need to look backward, really need to address those root causes of tension, marginalization, and poverty in West Papua, because temporary clashes, temporary rights violations in West Papua, both human and environmental rights violations in West Papua, are linked to the territory's unresolved political conflict. We really need to keep in mind that this violence, the conflict in West Papua, has a very serious gendered dimensions. Gendered acts are there to maximize exploitation. And it has magnified insecurity over land and resources, which have been further compounded by climate change impact. And that's sort of my concluding remarks on this. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Regina, in case I didn't meet anybody from yesterday. And my talk today is going to be on the con in conservation. And it's a topic that I'll get into in a minute as to how I got here, because it's actually originates from last year's presentation. So I'll talk about that for a little bit. And for those of you who were here last year, I'll get to the point because I don't need a whole hour like I did last year to talk about it. But I want to thank everybody for returning. Part of it is not, I don't need to romanticize it. You paid for it, so of course you were going to probably come back. But the other part of it too is that you've made an investment in this space and in these conversations, which I think is wonderful. 3 years ago when I created this conference, my intention was, a lot of it was to create dialogue around these issues because of the fact that in international criminal law, which is the area that I practice in as a lawyer, these conversations were often neglected and they weren't happening as often as I would like them. So my solution to that was to create the space. And so I hope from last year we've grown, and I hope next year we'll continue to grow. And I'm sorry I can't meet most of you in person, but it's been absolutely exciting to be able to work in this space and have this dialogue. So with that being said, I want to start off by talking about what I talked about last year a little bit, because that's where I got to the topic for this year. So I became obsessed with the Indian tiger last year, and it was not something that I was planning on doing. A lot of the work that I do is with different communities that are experiencing or going through genocide and crimes against humanity. And it was because of this book that I read by Dane Huckelbridge, and I highly recommend it. It's definitely in the Waterstones here in town. It's called No Beast So Fierce. And his book is about this people-eating tigress that roamed around northern parts of India and ended up killing about 500 or so people. And the estimates vary depending on who you're asking and who kept track of everything. So one of the things that he does in this book, and I won't spoil what the end of the story of Champawat was, but in the article that I ended up publishing in the Resolution Journal from last year's conference talks about it. So if you don't want to read the book, it's in the first part of the spoiler alerts in the first part of the opening paragraph of that article. But what Dane Huckelbridge does is he introduces the reader to really the role of the British Empire in India when it came to extraction and when it came to what it was actually using India for. So I really appreciate what Sylvia just said, because one of the big key points that I made last year, not only in my presentation, but also in the article that was published, is the fact that we cannot ignore environmental history when we talk about these things. And that anybody who does it, no matter what your profession is, and I think what Zoe said yesterday about us having to be interdisciplinary in this work is very important, because the reality is that we can't come to understanding how to solve things or how to resolve things if we're not working together. And so sometimes it means we have to have kind of a broad brush, but all of us bring our talents to the table with whatever we're good at. So environmental history played a very key part in what happened in India. Now, my article last year goes into the Forest Rights Act and what's happened to the tribal people who live in the forests, and it's technical and it goes through all the law, which I won't do today. I'm not going to be very technical. I want to focus really on a group of people that I am working with, and I'll get to them in a minute. So what ends up happening in that conversation last year is what I discovered is the international community and the way conservation people, whether it's an NGO or people who are pro-conservation, talk about an animal like the tigers, is they have a tendency to look at India and say, India, look at the numbers of the tigers, what's your problem? You've got to do something about it. And I say that this conversation is actually inaccurate and it's misplaced. And the reason why is because if you take environmental history into account, you'll know that under British colonial rule, the tiger was decimated and slaughtered, and it was used really as a way to, first it was vermin, and then it changed into a type of commodity that the British could make money off of. So they had hunting trips and they did all these things bringing people to India. So on the heels of that, when the British end up leaving India, what India inherited was the fact that they had the tiger population that's completely dwindled. But that problem, when we talk about it and when conservationists talk about it, they don't look at environmental history. You never hear them say, we understand the colonial history and the type of pressures that have been put on you, so let's work it out. Instead, we hear them say, what are you doing? How are you living? Why are the tigers dying? And so this, in and of itself, of course, informs where we're at today. And so if you look at a lot of the programs that are aimed at it and you look at the conservation lists, the other element to all these lists and programs is the fact that the tribal groups that are elements and key to what I argue in this article, to the tiger populations rebounding and their importance, they are also missing. And what the conservation community, in my opinion, and what my research is starting to show, tends to do, is they think by paying people or by saying like, hey, what do you think about this? Or working with governments, is to then ignore the factor of these tribal indigenous groups and their contribution to actually conserving and being able to protect the animals. So one of the groups that I talked about last year, which is what brought me to the stages where I'm at now, is the Saliga tribe. And in India, they actually revere the tiger. It is a deity for them in their religious practice. And eventually, because of the Forest Rights Act, they were evicted from the forests and they were just displaced, forcibly displaced. They're not refugees because they're not fleeing. They were just kicked out of where they were and where they've always been. And their entire culture, their history, everything is dependent on being in the forest. Well, they were one of the groups that actually were able to use the national green tribunals in India to their advantage, and they won the case against the government, and they were able to go back into the forest. And the tigers in the area, since that decision, have actually rebounded because the people are back. And so sometimes these models of conservation really, I think that they're misplaced. So what am I arguing this year and what am I talking about? It's very simple. I make 3 broad points in the article that I plan on publishing this year. The first is that conservation plans and policies, no matter who it is, no matter how well-intentioned they are, is missing environmental history. And environmental history is a very important component, which is why I think with what Sylvia said, it's wonderful, because you cannot slice up and say, here is this problem with colonialism, here's this military problem and political problem, and now let's talk about the environment. All of it really is connected and it's together. And so there's no way for us to do that. And if you look at the plans and the actions of many of the big non-governmental organizations that are on the ground with conservation, you don't see environmental history playing as a factor in how they evaluate programs. You see them doing something very different. So the first point that I make is that environmental history is important. The second point that I make is that conservation, while there are many groups that are doing a good job, so I'm not trying to take away from that, and I know it's very fashionable to just, kind of crap all over corporations now, but unfortunately I think we have to include a lot of people in that conversation now, which includes NGOs as well, because they are taking a more corporate mentality on, is that these conservation plans have actually turned into conservation plans. So they're con jobs in which more and more people are being forcibly displaced and or experiencing other forms of crimes like sexual violence or whatever other things they may be going through. And one of the things that we see that with is the fact that these NGOs and conservation organizations, when they go into a territory or into another country, they're working with governments that have an agenda already to forcibly remove these people or to destroy them, to commit genocide. And now they found a very benign way of doing it. Because many of us around the world will say, no, we want to make sure that the tiger lives, so do everything you can to save the tiger. And then we forget about the fact that there are people who have always been there and lived there. And part of this argument that I make in there is this concept of what we consider to be wild. What is that? I love Durrell's program that they have with rewilding, so I'm not here to critique that or criticize that. But what I will say is, when we think about the wild, how much of that and how much of that conversation has led to the erasure of people who have always been there, and that we don't really factor them in when we think about the wild. So a lot of these areas that we've now made green biospheres or the forests, and if you look at a place like the Amazon, that is a wild place, but it is also the home of many indigenous tribes who are now extremely suffering and are victims of what I would call genocide as a result of their livelihoods, their culture, and everything being destroyed. And so this is our concept of what is wild needs to be evaluated. And I look forward to being able to have that discussion about that. So rewilding, I think, is a little bit different than the concept of wild. And so I look at that. So that's really the second point, is that conservation has turned into conservation. And my favorite thing to do is, of course, always think of a catchy title for my paper. So, and then the third point that I make is simply that there's no need to invent new crimes. International criminal law, specifically genocide and the crimes against humanity, are exactly what we're seeing. The only difference is that when we talk about mechanisms like the International Criminal Court, maybe they're just not ready to handle the environmental issues. Maybe they still silo these issues, and I don't really think they are something that should be separate. And with the new Crimes Against Humanity Treaty that the International Law Commission is working on, what they've done, and this is just me being very, probably being a little flip about it, but they just basically cut and paste the Rome Statute onto a piece of paper because there's acceptance, right, by the international community for the Rome Statute. Of course, there are significant players missing, in my opinion, from the signing of that and acceptance of that treaty. But a national level Crimes Against Humanity treaty that can be incorporated could be a very good thing, but it is doing the same thing, which is that it is still, the elements of the environment, in my opinion, are still missing. And so how do we do that? And I think one of the ways we can do that is by incorporating the environment no matter what, as advocates, as activists, academics, whatever it is not separating it. And I think that's the first step that we have to do. So what I want to do is now talk about, and I don't know if, I'm pretty sure I will still use them as the example that illustrates the points that I make, but I want to spend some time talking about the Moken people. And the Moken people are very different from the other groups that communities that we've talked about so far between today and yesterday, in that they are not tied to land. They are actually sea nomads that live in the kind of Andaman Sea area. So there are two groups. It is one group, but they've split off from each other, and the history is a little bit convoluted as to who was which way first. But we know that the Moken people actually come from an ancient tribe that comes from the Sumatra area. But they've always been sea nomads. So they just, they get on their batangs, which are their boats, and they have gone around in the oceans, and they just kind of travel from one place to another. And the group eventually ended up in the Mirigwai archipelago. And I'm sure I'm saying all the Burmese names wrong, and the Thai names, I'm gonna probably say them all wrong too. But so they ended up in that archipelago, and then as many of you probably know, in Burma, the military took over by the end of the 1960s. And what they discovered, and the Burmese military is kind of like its own corporate enterprise, and so they have a tendency to do a lot of extraction-based activities, and it is to the detriment of many, many indigenous groups in Burma. What they discovered is in the Mirigwai archipelago were pearls. And one of the interesting things about Jersey is that the Jersey Pearl company is here, and every time I've gone into that store over the last 3 years, I always ask them, where are your pearls coming from? Because I don't want to buy it if it's from Burma or Myanmar, and generally I don't want to buy it if it's from China as well. but they do some of their pearls come from that. They come from Australia, they come from Japan. And so it's easy to know where they're coming from to avoid it. But so far, they don't have any pearls from Burma. But the military discovered the pearls in the Maragwai region, and what they decided was that the Moken people were a complete nuisance. And so what they did was they refused to, number one, allow them to kind of float the way that they have been and do their culture. So they're very dependent on fish. They're dependent on their cultural customs. Actually, babies are born in the boats, in the batangs. They have a lot of cultural customs, and their nutrition that they get is all from the ocean. So what the Burmese military did is they tethered them to the land. And they told them that you have to be on the land. And then they started abusing them. They started using them for forced labor. There were generals that went into the island called Pearl Island. They renamed it Pearl Island. They would abuse them sexually, use them as slaves. There was, at some point in time, drugs were introduced onto the island. So now a lot of the people have issues with either alcohol or drugs. And then we had, because of the amount of violence that the Burmese military is responsible for in the north of Burma, a lot of those groups fled down and came to these islands. So now you had these outsiders that were there, and they've pretty much mixed in with the Moken, whether the Moken liked it or not. And now we've seen like basically the destruction of that thing, and so of that group. And what's happened, I think the last estimate is, because the census isn't being properly taken, but we had researchers go on the ground and we counted probably close to full-blood Moken people, maybe only about 100 people left. Everybody else has been mixed in, or they've been forced to assimilate either through religion or with the other ethnic groups. So sometimes when you look at that area in the Maragwai, what you'll see is them referring to them as Kachin people. Because the Burmese military and the government, even if you think it's democratic, fine, but not really. They claim that it's that they won't give them their identity. They have national identity cards, but they don't have citizenship, and so they've tethered them to the land that way. So these people have been fighting for so long just to get back their autonomy to be able to do what is culturally there. And so this is an example of this end of the Moken people who are in Burma suffering as a result of extractive industries, and especially the pearls. And there are other things that are going on. So now Burma has an eye towards making this archipelago a tourist destination. So now you've got to tether them some more into the land and make sure that they don't come out and run around. And they do all sorts of things for the military when they're there. The other thing that's been happening in that area is dynamite fishing. So there's a lot of groups that come and will start throwing dynamite sticks in the water because it's just much easier to bring up the fish. And so this, of course, hurts the Moken people because they are sea nomads. They actually have the capability of diving underwater for several hundred feet. And that's something that none of us would probably do without the assistance of technology, with the diving equipment. And so they're able to do that, but they, unfortunately, this is causing a lot of problems because when they go into the water, now you've got the trawlers and you've got the fishing and then you've got the pearl people and you've got all these things going on. And so what they've been forced to do now is eat things that are not part of their diet, and it's pretty terrible. So that's the Moken of Burma. But there's also the other Moken of Thailand. And the Moken of Thailand, what has been said is that the Moken actually came to Burma, and then as a result of religious persecution, because the groups in Burma wouldn't allow them to practice their faith because it's animistic. It's not Buddhist, it's not Christian, it's not, Muslim, whatever the religion is they're trying to introduce, mainly Buddhism. Those, instead of giving up their faith, they just felt that it was better for them to relocate. So they would take to the seas, and one of the places they ended up, where there's about 700 Moken people of Thailand, are in the Surin Islands. And in the Surin Islands, what happened is they were there, and then in the 1980s, the government of Thailand decided, and I don't know how many of you have been to Thailand, I've never been, but it's very picturesque. There's a lot of beaches, so people like to come and play in the water and visit that stuff. The Surin Islands became a national park. And a lot of these governments will do that. They'll make it national parks, and then there is some type of economic profit or something that'll come from that. And so what they do is they take people by the boatloads to the Surin Islands from Thailand, and they'll arrive there, and they've tethered the Moken people to the land there too. and they live in these huts, and that's where they're supposed to be. Now, the Moken people, in order to survive, they have to do some kind of odd job. So maybe they'll be hired to wash dishes, maybe they'll do some kind of forced labor, but they sustain themselves on food like turtles, on different types of fish. And the government of Thailand has come in and said, these are all going extinct, so you can't have it anymore. You can't have any of this stuff, and they're not allowed to go fishing anymore, so that's off limits because it's part of the park. So all these things to destroy kind of and limit their heritage has happened, their culture. And then what has happened now is that there are a lot of narratives that have come out that the Moken people of Thailand, and I'm sure this is going to be happening in Burma, it might already be happening, is that they actually, they have to demean themselves by asking tourists to give them money, so they'll say, I'll dance for you, or you can take a picture with me, just so they can have money to eat. And this is what this group is. So now they've become a tourist attraction on the island. And actually, if you go to some of the websites, you'll see you can meet the natives of the island, and you can go on a tour, and you can see them. And this is really, I mean, in today's day and age, I can't even believe that it's disgusting, it's happening, and here we are. And so obviously from the Moken case, we can see a couple of things, right? The number one is the introduction of this idea of a national park, and then we have this element of conservation, right? Don't eat the turtles, don't eat the fish, everything you've ever survived on for centuries, even though you're an ancient tribe, you can't have it anymore. Go eat something from coconut from the palm tree and figure it out. And people who traditionally live in the ocean or live on the ocean, on the seas, they can't do any of those things anymore. And now, in addition to that, they're being forced to assimilate because the economic value of what is there is far greater for these governments than the people's lives and their heritage. And this is really, in effect, I think an argument can be made with a little bit more research. On the Thai side, I think a little bit more research needs to be made as to whether it rises to the level, meets the requirements for genocide. But I think on the Burmese side, I don't have really a whole lot of questions about that, because it's very clear that the Moken people are not something that the Burmese government wants because of the amount of pearls and the amount of money that they can make. And we see this with the Burmese military, with the Rohingya, with the Kachin, with the Chin. This is what they're doing in a lot of different places. And so that's the Moken example is one that I think is a very interesting one, because they're people who they're not land-based. So whereas with Tom's example and with Sylvia's example, we see people who reside in the forests, and then we have them. And there are different groups, I think, that really are suffering tremendously as a result of different types of projects that are conservation-based. And so some of the newest areas where we're seeing this is in the Himalayas. Because of climate change, a lot of groups want to go in and say, we have to protect this region, we have to protect this area. But you have a lot of different tribal groups that have been there, and the things that they think are good, right? They buy into this idea that, oh, this is really good, UNESCO wants to come in and make this a heritage site, but that heritage site doesn't give them any protection from anything, because what happens is the heritage site now removes them from the equation when it's really their territory and land. So essentially, my paper makes these arguments, and then eventually I go into the fact that some of the conservation examples that we have really are tantamount to genocide and crimes against humanity. So I think what I'll do is I'll stop there, because I'm sure there's a lot of interesting discussion points, and we can start however you want, and so I'm open for questions.